Okay, so we want to graph from negative 4 pi to positive 4 pi and show all the key points in between that interval. The first thing we need to do is figure out the period and figure out the key points that we would see within that period. Okay, so we find the period by 2 pi divided by 1/2 and invert and multiply to give us 4 pi. And then we take 1/4 of 4 pi to get pi. So each time we go a distance of pi, we'll see a key point. Let's go ahead and set up our axis system. Okay, so we have the axis system set up going from negative 4 pi to positive 4 pi. And this is working out nicely. We have key points each time we go a distance of pi. On the y-axis, we have gone up to 2 and down to 2 because we have an amplitude of 2. So let's go ahead and start plotting some points here. If we were to start off at 0 and plug in 0, we would end up with 0 over 2. So we'd end up with the sign of 0. So we say, what is the sign of 0? Sign of 0 is equal to 0. Our y value at 0 is equal to 0. So we have a point here. Next one we do, we plug in a pi. And so we have 2 times the sine of pi over 2. And so we find the sine of pi over 2. At pi over 2, we have a 1. So we have a 2 times 1. That gives us a 2. Next one we plug in is 2 pi. If we plug in 2 pi, we end up with 2 pi over 2 here, which reduces to just a pi, so we have the sine of pi times 2. The sine of pi is equal to 0. Our y value at pi is 0, so we go down to 0 here. And then we plug in 3 pi. We plug in 3 pi and we have 2 times the sine of 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2, sine of 3 pi over 2 gives us a negative 1. And so 2 times negative 1 is a negative 2. So 4 pi represents the end of the period, so I'll put another point there. And here is 1/2 of my graph. So we have one cycle drawn, so that means that I can draw the other one pretty darn easily just by looking at the pattern. And there's the graph from negative 4 pi to positive 4 pi. Okay, so for our next problem here, I have started off finding the period, and so I took 2 pi divided by 1/2 and found that my period now is 4 pi. I see key points each time I go 1/4 of 4 pi, which is pi. So what I want to know right now is what is a good start point and a good end point. So I'm going to set the entire quantity in here equal to 0 and solve for theta, and then 2 pi and then solve for theta. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so I've set up my angle equal to 0 and 2 pi, and I found that when I plug in pi, I end up with 0, and when I plug in 5 pi, I end up with 2 pi. So this represents the start and an end point of a period. It's going to give me some nice key points, 1/4 of the way in between, and also a 5 pi that represents the end of the interval, which I've given you guys. Let's go ahead and set up the axis system right now. So I've set up my axis system, and essentially I've started with 5 pi and worked my way backwards. I went back to 4 pi because I know my key points occur each time I go a distance of pi. So I just went pi backwards all the way to negative 3 pi. So that sets up the interval which I'm asking for. And let's go ahead and set up the y-axis and start plugging some points in. So I'm going to start off by plugging in pi and go to 5 pi. When I plug in pi into theta, when I plug in pi into theta, I know I will end up getting a 0. So I'm going to start off looking at 0 here. What is the sine of 0? It's equal to 0. So I have 3 times 0 plus 1, which gives me a 1 right at the spot. Start and the end of a period are the same, so I'm going to have another point right here. So when I plug in 2 pi, I'm going to end up getting pi over 2. I'm going to go to this point here and I say, what is the sine of pi over 2? The sine of pi over 2 is equal to 1. 1 times 3 is 3 plus 1 is 4. So the next point is going to be up here. You could plug that in and do the work if you don't believe me. Let's plug in 3 pi now. When we plug in 3 pi into theta will take us to pi. To pi. And so what is the sine of pi? Sine of pi is equal to 0. So that's going to take me down here because 3 times 0 plus 1 is going to give me a 1. So then we plug in 4 pi into theta. And if we plug in 4 pi, that's going to take us to 3 pi over 2. And the sine of 3 pi over 2 is equal to negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. Minus 3 plus 1 is equal to a minus 2, which is this point here. So this represents one cycle of our graph so far. To find the other part of our graph here, we simply need to look at the pattern. So what happens prior to pi? We look at what happens prior to 5 pi. And so we go down to a negative 2. What happens prior to this negative 2? We went to a 1. So we just follow the cycle. And here is the rest of our graph. So I didn't necessarily plug in points for you guys, but I did show you the essentials of what you would need. Okay? Alright. See you in the next problem.